Okay, hello, good afternoon, everyone. Or if you're zooming in from Indonesia, good morning. I'm Eve, I'm the director of the ANU Indonesia Institute, and I'm very pleased to be welcoming you all to our first webinar for 2025. Before we begin, I'd like to recognise that I'm zooming in from the lands of the Ngambri and the Ngunnawal people, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past and present. So yes, welcome to our first in what is actually going to be an online webinar series, a new one for 2025 here at the ANU Indonesia Institute. It's called Indonesia's Political Pulse. So every few months or whenever we think there is a big pressing political issue that we need to unpack, we'll be bringing together ANU political scientists together with guest experts to hold these sorts of webinars on and off throughout 2025. And today we are turning to our panel of experts for their early assessments of the Prabowo presidency. As we know, Prabowo was elected last year, inaugurated late last year, and now he's been in office for about just over 4 months. And so we're going to be taking stock of what the Prabowo presidency looks like so far. Before we start, I just want to remind our speakers and to tell our audience that we are recording this seminar, this panel discussion, so that we can begin to build up a collection of our political pulse seminars to post on our website. So please do go to our website and join our mailing list, the ANU Indonesia Institute mailing list, so you can hear about future events just like this one and all sorts of other events that we're holding this year. Okay, so let me do some super quick introductions of our panelists. We only have an hour together today, so I will make this super quick. You can obviously Google them and look at their illustrious careers and long lists of publications. From the ANU, we have Marcus Mietzner. Marcus is an expert on Indonesian politics with a special focus on political parties, elections, presidents, and he is just putting the finishing touches on his new book on the Jokowi presidency. Also from ANU, Liam Gammon, he's a research fellow at the East Asia Bureau of Economic Research at the ANU. I already said that, he's already at ANU. And he also sits on the editorial board of East Asia Forum, and he's the editor of New Mandalas, two publications that we have here at ANU, where you can get all sorts of fantastic, short, sharp analysis of political events across the Southeast Asian region and East Asian region. And our special guest from the University of Melbourne is Ken Setiawan. Ken is a senior lecturer in Indonesian studies, and she's also a deputy director at the Asia Institute at the University of Melbourne. She's an expert in human rights, transitional justice, Indonesian politics more broadly. Okay, so we have an hour together. The way we run these sorts of panels is that we don't have any presentations. Basically, I'll be asking our panelists a bunch of questions. They can ask each other questions. We try to keep it informal, engaging. And so we'll sort of be chatting amongst ourselves for about 30 minutes. And then I will open it up to Q&A from our audience. We have a really big audience today. We had lots of registrants. We've got about 100 people in the room so far. So please put your questions as you think of them in the Q&A box. And I will endeavour to get to as many as I can. You can help me by making your questions super short and sharp. I don't think I've forgotten anything that I need to. If I have forgotten any of the housekeeping, our Indonesia Institute admin assistant and manager extraordinaire, Hatiza, will pop some extra information in the chat or Q&A box. Okay, I did that all in 4 minutes. Congratulations to me. So that gives us lots of time to talk about the substance, to get into the substance of our panel today. So we're going to be talking about Prabowo's presidency so far. So if we kind of cast our minds back to early 2024, when Prabowo was campaigning for the presidency, we'll remember that his platform was really one of continuity. So he obviously had the incumbent president's son, Gibran Rakabuming Raka, on the ticket, and he is now vice president. But he also made a special effort, explicitly, in fact, to say that he was going to continue Jokowi's policies, particularly in the economic space. And this is really a continuity ticket. And so a lot of observers, business people, analysts sort of saw the transition from Jokowi to Prabowo as one that was pretty low risk. But if we look at sort of what's been happening in the last few months, Prabowo's sort of broken actually with with Jokowi in many ways in terms of policy direction and the way that he's been governing. And at times it's been pretty chaotic. We've seen sort of proposals for quite radical tax changes, but then they were cancelled. We've seen really dramatic budget cuts across a whole range of ministries. Markets have been a bit up and down in response. And quite early in his presidency, we've seen street protests as well against Prabowo and his policies. So I remember that Jokowi's first months were pretty chaotic as well. But Liam, I might start with you. Against this sort of backdrop, how might you, very sort of broad terms, characterize Prabowo's first few months in office? Are we just seeing teething problems here, a bit like Jokowi, or are we learning something, fundamental here, even now at this early stage, about the way Prabowo makes policy or governs?
Yeah, I mean, there are a couple of questions there. I mean, teething problems is it's probably a good way of putting it, which is odd for someone who has been in the public eye for so long, who has been in politics for so long, and who has been, thinking about policy and developing a vision for Indonesia for so long. But I think that they're actually probably intimately related with each other. Unlike Jokowi, Prabowo is a guy who came to the presidency with a very clear idea of what he stood for and what he wanted to do. And he thinks he has all the answers. He doesn't, of course. And you're seeing that being put into practice. What really strikes me about the early period of the the Prabowo presidency, rather, and I should emphasize that I haven't actually spent a lot of time in Jakarta since he's been inaugurated, so this is very much a view from afar, is the fact that he behaves somewhat like Jokowi did towards the end of his term. He's a guy who thinks he has the answers. He is surprisingly isolated and somewhat insular, even from quite senior ministers, quite alienated from what you might call Indonesia's technocratic elite. So he's governing within the first few months like someone who seems to have been there like a long time. So yeah, I'm not sure whether you would call that teething problems or the opposite problem, but let's call it the teething problems of someone who is in a sense probably a little too over prepared for the presidency for his own good, at least in his own mind. So take, for example, these budget cuts that we're seeing. Prabowo comes into the office having talked for years and years about the idea that Indonesian taxpayers' money is being wasted by the bureaucracy. And he comes in and he enacts these very much, I mean, I know it's lazy to draw Trump analogies, but these very much sort of Elon Musk style kind of swinging cuts to government budgets without much apparent thought as to whether this is actually necessary to repair the budget, without much thought to whether this actually severely, imperils the ability of some agencies and parts of the bureaucracy to do their jobs. To give examples, anyone who's been talking to people, as we have, who work in government in Indonesia, will have collected all sorts of bizarre stories about agencies for instance, who've had their travel budgets zeroed out. Agencies like including diplomats and trade negotiators and auditors whose jobs depend on being able to travel, for instance. The office supplies budget goes down 90%. So you are having people skimp on basic necessities of keeping an office running, that sort of thing. So he's doing, he's doing the sort of things that, in some senses, Jokowi was scared off from early in his term. You remember that Jokowi tried to sort of bring down the budget for bureaucratic meetings and so on, and travel down. Then sort of industry groups warned him, hang on a second, so much of the domestic hotel and travel industry and hospitality industry is dependent on government spending. So I think it's kind of a little entry point that these budget cuts into seeing how Prabowo makes decisions. He doesn't strike me as someone who consults wisely before making these sort of seat of the pants decisions. But again, that's exactly what you would expect from someone who has, throughout his decades in public service, in public life, and especially since he got back into politics in the post-Reformasi era, he's never really run an organization where he has had to solicit people's advice, where he has had to build internal coalitions. He has always been the boss, the undisputed boss of the organization. And even when he was defense minister, he wasn't really known for being a, let's say, an extremely diligent, hands-on administrator, right? So I think it's quite an odd situation. I think you're seeing the signs of someone who is actually kind of quite inexperienced in running a huge bureaucracy and being across the details. And at the same time, someone who has a very fixed idea in their mind of what they want to do.
Yeah.
And so I think the chaos that we're seeing is slightly born from that. Sorry, I didn't really answer your question
Oh,
about
you
the
did.
continuity versus change question, but I mean we can probably get to that as the conversation rolls on.
Yeah, no, that was fascinating. And I think that is the sort of the interesting sort of juxtaposition that he's had a lot of these, big ideas about what he wants to do when he gets into power. But unlike someone like Jokowi, hasn't actually been in government except as Minister for Defense. But unlike Jokowi, he didn't have to sort of, as you said, build consensus in many ways or deal with big bureaucracies for as long as Jokowi did, or even small bureaucracies. I also underlined the point that you made about this, that he strikes you as being somewhat alienated from technocrats. And isolated, insulated. I mean, these are really interesting things for a president, or words to describe a president so early on, right, in his period in office. And so I might now turn to Marcus to think about, to sort of, unpack this a little bit more. So who was Prabowo listening to then, Marcus, do you think? We know that he has a sort of very small number of sort of loyalists. He has an old military ally, he has his adjutant, he has Dasko from Garindra, he has his brother. But where is the power balance lying when it comes to sort of policy making here? And are there ministers that he's listening to? Are there coalition partners he's listening to? Who is influencing him, so far?
Yeah, first of all, since you have been encouraging us to have a discussion and to disagree with each other, let me start with that. I actually don't think that Prabowo had a very clear idea what he wanted to do when he became president. There were all the sound bites from his campaign, stump speeches, and so forth. And throughout the first 2 or 3 months of the presidency, he resorted to the repetition of those sound bites. There was very little policy detail, and I really don't think by the time he was elected, and then he had a lot of time, actually, he was the president in Indonesian history with the longest preparation time after his election to get into office. There wasn't much policy detail spelled out. So no, I think he did come in with some vague ideas, and then it was essentially policy on the run. I also don't think that the parallel to Trump is as clear as it is, because what Trump is doing is actually abolishing positions that then leads to a reduction in the budget. What Prabowo is doing is he's keeping all of the positions. He explicitly doesn't want to fire anybody, but he cuts the operational budget, which means he's sending tens and hundreds of thousands of civil servants into their ministries, and where they then have nothing at all to do. Or sometimes they don't actually go to the ministry at all. They're actually being told to sit at home because in the ministry there's no light and there's no air condition. So in terms of who he's listening to, and that relates to what I just said, I don't think we should think about presidents, and whether that's Jokowi or Prabowo, in terms of the advisors telling them what to do. They are looking at the president for some guidance so that they then come back with some more detailed policy advice. That's how it often works, where they try to read the president. What is it that the president wants? And let me roll out now here for you how this could look like. So I think with Prabowo, in the same way, we need to understand him in this context where the people that you mentioned, Dasko, his brother Shafri Shamsuddin, or even Lieutenant Colonel Teddy, who is very close to him, they are so close to him that they know he doesn't want input that he deeply disagrees with. So they try to think about what it is that he actually wants and then give him proposals. Now, I think, this whole competition among his closest advisors, it is, I think, by all accounts, Dasko, who is the most important one. That is because he's combining a whole range of positions in one. He's the de facto leader of the parliament. He is formally only the deputy speaker, but everybody knows that he is actually running the parliament. He's also running the party de facto, and he now also has an office in Prabowo's palace. So he's bringing all of these strings together. Everybody else is sort of scrambling for influence, I think, including Teddy, and I think they are just as confused at times as we are what exactly it is that Prabowo wants. As you mentioned, the one thing that Prabowo had always talked about, and Liam talked about this, is there has been this leakage of funds from the Indonesian budget for many years of about 30%, and now he wants to prove with these budget cuts that he's right. Now that doesn't mean, and I know that a lot of people in his inner circle disagree with what he's doing, but nobody is really telling him that they think this is a disastrous thing to do. So again, and this is, I believe, one of the differences to the Jokowi government. Jokowi had a lot more sounding boards. He was meeting a lot more people. He was meeting much more frequently with his ministers. Prabowo limits these meetings, and when he does have these broader meetings with ministers, as I understand it, it's often a monologue by Prabowo rather than a real conversation. So again, I think if we look at the advisors, they are also struggling to read where exactly the journey is going.
Yeah, fascinating. Thanks, Marcus. Yeah, and I am encouraging us to disagree and, find points of contention here. So I will come to Ken, but if Liam, you wanted to defend your position there, which actually I agree with, that I think we can sort of distinguish between Prabowo coming into office with big ideas. So prove that there's been budget leakage. The big ideas about food sovereignty, big ideas about stunting, but no clear policy plan of how to achieve sort of broad, in some ways sort of ideological or long-held beliefs about where Indonesia needs to change. But how do you do it? What are the policy mechanisms that you need to do? And that's why that's what I would say there's been all this chaos, because he comes in without a clear sense of how to kind of execute some of these sort of big ideas that he's been talking about on and off for a long time. That's how I would sort of say, I think Liam probably.
Yeah, and with that, we don't have a disagreement because, of course, he had that. That's what I meant with the sound bites. Those were ideas. But how to do it, what exactly he wanted to do, I think he was just as confused about that as anybody else.
Yeah. So sound bites, big ideas, a bit of policy chaos in the execution. And the result of all that is that we've actually seen some street protests in response. And I wanted to turn to Ken to talk about this a bit. And perhaps for anyone in the audience who isn't totally across the details, maybe Ken, you could talk a little bit about who these protesters were and why they took to the streets, and whether you think these particular protests that we're seeing so early in Prabowo's presidency, whether they matter politically.
Yeah, thanks, Eve. Let me start by that first point that you make about that these protests are emerging so early on in Prabowo's presidency. I suppose, that's right. He's 4 or 5 months in now. But I think if we just go back a little bit in history, we actually see regular protests emerging. So we can think of the 2019 protests, which were about a wide range of issues, including the weakening of the KPK, the Corruption Eradication Commission at the time, protests against the Omnibus Law and Job Creation in 2020, and then the 2022 student protests in response to a possible delay to the last elections and attempts to extend Jokowi's term in office. So the way that I see it is that we have seen repeatedly protests emerge in Indonesia in response to government policy and action. And we see, in particular, quite an important role taken by student movements and organizations in these protests. The current protests have been called Indonesia Gelap, or Dark Indonesia, and we already spoke a little bit about the government budget cuts that these protests respond to. Both Liam and Marcus alluded to, you know, the slashing of travel and stationery budgets. We have reports on, you know, that lights are being turned off, that elevators can't be used, cuts to access to drinking water. But I think it was Marcus who just mentioned about, you know, these operational budgets. And I just wanted to mention a few big cuts at government bodies that, in my opinion, are really critical when we talk about things such as human rights protection, law enforcement, and gender equality. So one example are the cuts to the LPSK, or the Victim and Witness Protection Agency, whose budget was slashed by more than 60%. We have bodies such as Komnas HAM, the National Human Rights Commission, and the Judicial Commission, whose budgets were slashed about a half or more than half. And if we look at gender issues, then I think it's very concerning that the budget for the Ministry of Women's Empowerment and Child Protection has been cut by nearly 50%. Also, the budget of Komnas Perempuan, so the Women's Rights Commission, has taken a huge hit. These cuts have real impact. So yes, Prabowo is not firing people here, but they have a huge impact on the work of these organizations. So it's operational costs, but that operational work has a huge impact on people's everyday lives. So one example is the medical assistance provided through to survivors of human rights abuses through the LPSK. And people are very much dependent on this assistance for their daily needs. So I think, you know, it's more than it's important to think about the impact of these cuts on people's everyday lives. So I already mentioned the protests have been very much student-led. The protesters have argued that the cuts and other policies are not pro-people or not for the people. And I think this is the interesting point. It's not an immediate response to these budget cuts alone. It's about other things as well. So including widespread corruption, mining licenses, land grabs, involvement of the military in civilian affairs, a lack of protection for Indigenous people, also calls to further reforms of the police. And I think this is also important when we think about the figure Prabowo himself and his human rights track record, the rejection of proposed amendments to the military, police and prosecutor laws that could reinforce impunity. And these are actually themes that have emerged in previous protests as well. So maybe this is a long answer to your question, Eve, but yes, early on in Prabowo's presidency, but also highlighting really important and systematic issues in Indonesian politics today.
Yeah. Can I just sort of quickly, I think it's a really excellent answer, because it is, we're seeing these protests as part of sort of a broader movement and the re-emergence of pro-democracy and the defense of pro-democracy protests that we saw sort of throughout, you know, especially the second half of the Jokowi presidency. I guess one quick follow-up is, do you think Prabowo cares about protests, from what you know and what based on what we've seen so far?
Well, I think there's been a little bit of a mixed response in that sense that some senior government officials have said that they respected the demands or understood the grievances, and that the government is, you know, used to dealing with criticism and that they will deal with it. But then at the same time, Prabowo has actually explicitly come out to say that he will not back down on his plans, that he's been very critical of excessive spending. He's been very critical of, you know, travel and, you know, study trips overseas. Actually, in that context, explicitly mentioned people going to Australia for study trips. So I thought that was interesting. And there's also been a little bit, you know, response to students by saying, okay, you are complaining about these things, but these policies will actually benefit you. Right. So I think politically, I don't think they've mattered much yet. Prabowo actually has very high approval ratings.
That's a good point.
You know, if we think like after 100 days in office, I believe it was over 80%, right? So, you know, I think we don't yet directly see that impacting on his approval rating.
No, that's a good point. Liam, did you want to jump in on that question at all about sort of Prabowo's response to protests? Marcus has accidentally muted himself and now can't unmute himself. So hopefully Hatiza can help us with that. Oh no,
Sorry.
now yeah. Did you want to jump in on that, or I've got another question for you? If you
Oh, no, not much more to add, except that just on the question of Prabowo's sensitivity to protests, I mean, hard to say really. I mean, one thing that if you wanted to read it this way, the higher education minister, the higher education minister was reshuffled out of cabinet. He was sacked. So there's, if you want to read it that way, you could say that he may have paid the price for being the target of student protests, or indeed have been seen to have not done enough to sort of head off student protests. But I would just say it is nonetheless interesting that protests are still able to organize pretty quickly and get out there, given the scale of the repression that was meted out to the Reformasi di Korupsi protests and subsequent student protests. So it's interesting to watch. Yeah, that's all I'll say.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. Ken, a couple of years ago, wrote a great. Oh, Seth, sorry, I will.
Just to follow up on Liam's point, thankfully, the fired minister has actually told the story of how he was fired in public. He said that Lieutenant Colonel Teddy visited him at night and told him in no uncertain terms that Prabowo blamed him for the protests that had ensued, and that Prabowo was allergic to protests, that therefore he had made a fatal mistake. So these are all quotes, that he had made a fatal mistake, and that led to his firing. So the context was that the minister had actually shown up in Parliament that day and had told the public that because of the budget cuts, students would have to pay more tuition fees. That was one of the big triggers for the movement. Prabowo saw it as such, and therefore the minister had to go. So the only minister so far who has been dismissed.
So yeah, I mean, this seems really important, doesn't it? That he is sensitive to protest, and this is something that, you know, Ed and Maya, two people who are authoring a really good chapter in a book that's coming out that I'm editing, shameless plug, on the return of protest and on student movements, as you know, throughout Indonesian history, not just being the sort of the vanguard of reform, but being a major and important sort of actor in the protection of democracy. And that continues today. And in fact, it's as important now as it was at the end of the 90s, potentially. Just the last few minutes before I open up to Q&A, because we've kind of segued into this question of sort of, I guess, democratic quality under Prabowo. You know, obviously for very obvious reasons, given Prabowo's past, there's been a lot of speculation about, you know, what will happen to democracy under Prabowo. And we know that he's inherited a far weaker democracy than the one Jokowi inherited 10 years ago, with serious attacks on competition and checks and balances over the last few years, including during the election. And, you know, one of the things that Prabowo has done in the past, and one thing that he's actually talked about from time to time in the last few months, or questions have been raised about direct elections, direct regional elections, so elections for governors and Bupati. And there's sort of questions about whether Prabowo is open to, perhaps may even demand the rolling back of direct elections, again, as he did back in 2014. So just quickly, Liam, and we'll try and keep these answers a little bit, you know, sort of short and sharp. Based on what we know about Prabowo as a political figure, but also now knowing his sensitivity, right, to forms of protest, do you think there is a real chance that we could see the end of direct elections in Indonesia? I know we're speculating here, but sort of based on what we know.
I mean, I'll take that question very, very literally and say, yes, there is a real chance that direct elections could be abolished. Beyond that, I mean, that's not the kind of thing I would want to make predictions about, except to say that they do have a few years to sort it out and test the waters and push the envelope and other such cliches. You can be certain, however, that first of all, Prabowo, if you know, the threat of, say, protests or criticism of civil society doesn't weigh on his mind, then I mean, you're pushing on an open door trying to convince Prabowo to abolish direct elections. He doesn't like it. Doesn't even like direct presidential elections. We know that. Likewise, I think with most of the political parties, the question is that at the very moment when it becomes sort of, as it were, crunch time to decide that question, which will require legislative change, right? What is the political atmosphere? What is Prabowo's approval rating? What is the effectiveness of whatever coercion he's meting out on political party leaderships? What are the calculations of individual party leaders with regards to their like very, very short-term political interests in the lead up to the 2029 presidential elections and or the next round of local elections. So they have years to figure it out, but I think a lot of it will come down to exactly what the political landscape looks like at the moment when it comes time to actually amend the relevant legislation. But I don't think there's no reason for that to happen in a hurry. There's no reason why Prabowo would spend political capital on that now, except for the fact that, I mean, look, the KPU does have to start preparing for that a long time in advance.
So
but I mean, markets would have a better sense of how the politics of that are playing.
Well, let's go to that question of sort of, I guess, the preferences of parties in the coalition and Prabowo's capacity to kind of bring that coalition into line. I don't know, Marcus, did you want to comment on that sort of first question about elections, or on this question of sort of where the political parties line up?
Yeah, so obviously we need to sort of disaggregate what elections we're talking about.
Right.
Prabowo has made it clear internally that he doesn't want to get rid of direct presidential elections, and at the moment, as Liam indicates, it would be not in his interest, because he's arguably at the moment the only one who can certainly win direct elections. Everybody else, you know, in his surrounding, the people who are leading the parties are unelectable as presidential candidates. So it will be much about the approval ratings and so forth. But when we're talking about local elections, I think he's very much determined to phase them out. And then we have to disaggregate, are we talking about gubernatorial elections or district head elections? And I think we will, in a relatively short period of time, see attempts by his team to target gubernatorial elections as some sort of stepping stone for further action on that. So we'll have to see. The parties, I think, are all over the place on this. Some have said that they would agree with the abolition of gubernatorial elections. PKB, for instance, said we've always said this, and fantastic. But with the implication, of course, that they do not agree with the abolition of mayor and district head elections, let alone the abolition of presidential elections. So this will be a complicated policy field, but I think, and I heard that Prabowo has expressed his confidence in a meeting recently where he said, you know, I have an 80% approval rating. I can push this through, although he was told that, of course, there's very strong support among the population for direct local elections.
Mm-hmm. And just a final word to Kim before I turn to some questions. You know, on elections, how do you think civil society would respond? I mean, surely there'd be a pretty united attempt to defend regional elections, gubernatorial and or district?
Yes.
Or maybe not.
If I can just quickly go back to
sure.
the comment that Liam made about Prabowo being allergic to protests. I think, you know, that's largely illustrative of broader criticism of liberal democratic values. And maybe in relation to this, and this call for ending direct elections, local direct elections, in 2014, Prabowo actually led the opposition coalition that passed legislation to roll back direct elections for regional leaders, which at the time was overruled, right?
Yes.
And also in that context, he commented that direct elections were a Western idea, incompatible with Indonesia's cultural traditions. Now, that use of culturalist arguments is not, anything unique to Prabowo. We've seen this being done by other government officials in other contexts, including in discussions on historical and transitional justice. So it has been deployed, culturalist arguments have been deployed by politicians to avoid accountability, to promote their own interest, and to reverse prior democratic gains. And I think that is something to bear in mind. I think if we look generally at elections and what they mean, I think it's really important to understand or to remember that elections are generally regarded as a hallmark of Indonesia's democracy. There's quite a sense of pride and around the fact that Indonesia has been able to successfully, although there have been many other issues, of course, but we have seen regular elections. Voter turnout has been consistently high. Similarly, the direct local elections that were introduced as part of the decentralization have very much considered a cornerstone for reform. To come back to your question, I think pro-democracy civil society organizations will likely see a revision as another indicator of democratic backsliding or regression. They might argue it will reduce opportunities for public participation. They might remind the public of the fact that when Prabowo first tried to push through in 2014, it was strongly opposed. Now, the political circumstances are, of course, very different now as they were then. Prabowo very much at the losing end at that point politically, and of course now he's in the president's seat with a very high approval rating. I would also think, but I'm sure within all the people that are here, there's people that could better answer the question of what civil society organizations would do. But I would think that that would be a response, and that the argument would also be that it's an indicator of centralization of power.
Yeah.
Further echoing the authoritarian past. So
yeah, exactly.
yeah.
I liked your point about how do we interpret that phrase allergic to elections. You can kind of do things with your to respond to your allergy.
Yeah.
You can sort of respond to the protesters by sort of very quickly appeasing them and to end protests, or you can repress them. And so it'll be interesting to see how and as you say, from the language he uses, that
you can blame someone else for what's happening without taking responsibility.
Right.
So,
exactly.
Yeah.
No, I'm going to have to cut us off because there are actually a lot of really, really good questions. And what I'm seeing is I could kind of group them into two. One is a sort of focus on the role of technocrats and economic policy. And I'm going to come back to that because there's some interesting ones, especially around Sri Mulyani. Her name has come up in several of these questions. So I'm going to come to that. But while we're just kind of talking about democracy, there's a couple of people have asked this, and it's about PDIP and the problem of a missing opposition in Indonesia. So people who've been studying Indonesian politics, who've been talking about sort of large coalitions and a lack of an effective opposition for many, many years. But it seems a bit different already in the Prabowo presidency. So the only party that's not officially in government is PDIP. And recently we saw the arrest of one of the sort of the SecGen of PDIP, Hasto. So maybe this is a question for Marcus. What does this kind of conflict with PDIP at the moment tell us about Prabowo's approach to coalitions, and how serious is this problem of a missing opposition in Indonesia now compared to in the past?
Yeah, first of all, in terms of coalition building, Prabowo is continuing the set that he had found, the blueprint he has found, not only from Jokowi, but from Yudhoyono as well. So far, what we've seen in the last 20 years is that every president who came to power has further accelerated, further intensified the inclusiveness of government coalitions. They've become bigger and fatter and more integralistic. Now this cabinet, as everybody knows, I think has 117 members. They had to physically increase the space in the palace to fit everybody in. So that shows that Prabowo, quite in contrast to the image that he presented in the past, remember, the parties, they are rotten and they need to be buried and they need to be, I'm coming in and I will drain the swamp. He has actually brought the swamp in with him quite literally. Now, PDIP is the only one that stands outside. Nasdem is a bit of a specific case. I won't go into the details of that, but he wants PDIP to at least declare that it is not hostile towards the administration. Whether PDIP then will be in government or not through its cadres, that's a matter of political cosmetics. Those of you who are into reading these cosmetics know that Budi Gunawan, for instance, is already in government, a very close confidant of Megawati. Now, in this context, and that's how Eve's question started, the arrest of Hasto Kristianto, the two-time Secretary General of PDIP, is leverage that Prabowo is using to extract that concession from PDIP, a statement that they will not be in opposition and so forth. That in itself is not new at all. Jokowi has done it several times. One of the ways through which he brought P3 at the time into his government was by enjoying the arrest of its chairman, Soyadam Ali, at the time. So the use of legal instruments, the use of the KPK, the use of the Attorney General's office, the use of the police in order to push political parties to do what the president wants, that's not new at all. And I think Prabowo is just getting warmed up in enjoying these coercive authorities of his office.
Did anyone want to add anything? Liam, did you want to add anything to that? Or can we move on?
No, I'm just interested in this question of also the big innovation. And speaking of things that sort of come out of nowhere, that sort of fly by the seat of your pants governance, Danantara as well. I mean, the big, in a sense, it's can it be read as both continuity with Jokowinomics, but also as a rupture. So, I mean, I want to actually ask you a question, Eve.
Oh.
Is this going to be Indonesia's 1MDB?
Well, it's actually, well, while you were sort of going on to Danantara, I was like, oh my God, we have questions on Danantara. And the question from the panelist is basically something similar to that. What is the best? So for anyone who doesn't know what Danantara is, it is basically meant to be, or one version, an early proposal for it was to be the next sort of Temasek. So a big sort of sovereign wealth fund of sorts, and then it sort of emerged into a big state-owned holding company, and under it will be all of the assets of Indonesia's major SOEs. So it's meant to be able to sort of reinvest that money and create wealth for Indonesia. But the concern is that it could be, it might not be Temasek, it might end up being something like what happened in Malaysia with the 1MDB scandal. And so, you know, Marcus, Liam, is it going to be the next 1MDB? I mean, the concern is that that as far as I can see, and Marcus, you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but the finance ministry in the latest iteration of the law is actually not playing as much of an oversight role as it was in an earlier sort of proposal. And that a lot of the control is coming through the SOE ministry. There is a board of commissioners, of course, and the president himself. And I think that's why some people have been sort of, you know, ringing alarm bells. Marcus, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, so the biggest change in this new legislation is that the SOEs that were formerly always owned by the finance ministry, now they were run in the past by the SOE ministry, but they were owned by the finance ministry, that is now changing. And it's essentially moving to Danantara. The SOE ministry continues to hold 1% of these assets. But as Eve mentioned, the SOE minister, Eric, is actually quite happy with the current changes because he remains in charge of the supervisory board. I think the important thing here, and I only learned this over the last few days, because a lot of people thought, you know, Prabowo is cutting the budget because he's so concerned about the lunch program, which we haven't talked about, but which is also a really important program for Prabowo. But that's really only a very small part of what he wants to fund. He wants to shift a lot of the money into Danantara, which then will finance all these high-cost projects, like, for instance, oil refineries. And so Indonesia's big problem has always been that it cannot refine oil at home. It has to export its own crude oil and then re-import it from refined, you know, countries with refinery facilities. Now, refineries, as everybody understands, I think, are some of the biggest costs in natural resource processing and so forth. And so this is what he wants to direct Danantara towards, these really big budget items that so far Indonesia hasn't been able to stem, in a way the equivalent to the smelters that, you know, were built with Chinese help. So that's where some of his ideas are coming through. But of course, I mean, you're talking about one of the biggest patronage opportunities for the political elite here. And I think that's where the very legitimate concerns about the comparison with Malaysia comes in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that actually, the question of the finance ministry and that shift. I mean, Danantara is sort of one example of potential, or a sort of, you know, the people have had to readjust their kind of view of Sri Mulyani, I think, and her role, because in the lead up to the elections and and just after the elections, I should say, one of the big concerns of foreign investors and foreign observers and foreign governments was who's going to be the finance minister. And everyone thought Srimulyani would be out, but there's sort of, I guess, there's a kind of a view in many parts, both within Indonesia, but also very much internationally, that if you don't have someone like Srimulyani, then, Indonesia's economy is in big trouble. Now she's there, but we are seeing sort of quite chaotic economic policy making. The revised version of Danantara, as you said, gives the finance ministry less influence, power, stake. So, and this is a couple of questions from the audience have said, what's happening to her? Why, does she not have the same influence that she used to have? And that's a question for anyone. And then I've got one for Ken. So does anyone want to step into that and answer that question?
Yeah, I think it's pretty clear she has been largely sidelined. She had nothing to do with the budget cuts, which of course is ironic, given that she is the minister. This was done by Prabowo's nephew in cooperation with Dasko. And even when she was asked to then have a second look at it, this was purely cosmetic in nature. There's also been quite interesting developments in her ministry. So one of her dirigents, one of her director generals, was actually taken out with a legal case because he had raised objections towards the budget cuts. So in the middle, we saw a 20-year-old legal case against that person being dug out by law enforcement, and he was taken out. So that also sent shockwaves throughout the finance ministry not to do anything that Prabowo could see as insubordination. So yes, she's pretty much on the sidelines at the moment.
I have a question.
Yeah, not much.
Sorry, yeah, go, Liam. Sorry, go on.
Oh no, not much that, but just the fact that she is also reputed to be, among all the ministers, the one who's most confident in giving Prabowo bad news and telling him that his ideas are not as well conceived as he thinks they are. And for that reason, I mean, is now the subject of rumors about how long she will actually last in the cabinet. And I think that if she is swapped out for someone else, I mean, that would be a genuine sign about how much, or rather how little, the government actually cares about the views of, technocrats, let alone investors. So yeah, again, I don't know anything about that, but if she were to be replaced, that would be a sign of their mindset.
Yeah. So we've got so many questions. I'm just going to move it right along. We've got quite a few here that relate to sort of Ken's comments, and they're sort of linking two things. So a couple of comments have sort of talked about, first of all, given the sort of state of Indonesia's democracy at the moment, what can be done to strengthen civil society? I'm sure you get this question a lot, Ken. Is there a role for sort of international players in any sense? Does it help or hinder, civic activism and NGOs, under a Prabowo presidency to the extent that they can assist? Actually, I'll start with that and then I'll move on to this other question of the military. Yeah.
Well, I think, the broader question is around, democratic resilience, right? And how can democratic resilience be fostered? And we can talk about different things then, whether it's elections or judicial or legislative oversight, but of course, civil society and the media. And I suppose with increased pressures or increased deterioration on vertical accountability, on limits on judicial and legislative oversight, then it automatically kind of goes to civil society and media. And, I've seen people say, civil society has to do something about this. But that it's not as simple as that. By which I'm saying I don't want to undermine the important role of civil society organizations that promote liberal democratic values. But we have to think about the just structural problems or challenges of Indonesia's civil society, which include fragmentation and other structural weaknesses, including funding. You mentioned international funding, but that too is, has not just now, but has for years already been more challenging, right, to get funding, whether that is from domestic whether it comes from a domestic market, so to speak, or from elsewhere. And I also think that we have to be mindful about what civil society can actually achieve. We have to bear in mind that the bigger power constellations in which these groups operate and what they are up against And we also know, I think, many stories of the criminalization of activists and the continuous pressure that many activists are under. To me, the protest, if we go back to the protests to me are an indicator that people remain very observant and very critical, and that there is that attachment to liberal democratic values. And that in itself is a sign of democratic resilience, even if it's just maybe just a small glimmer of hope. So what can be done to be strengthened? Of course, you can say funding is of course important, but it isn't, unfortunately, not as simple as just putting money into something. It's also about creating structures that are sustainable, that are not dependent on particular people, and that it is it costs investment, and it costs requires investment of time of people. Yeah, I suppose that's not a really good answer, Eve.
What's the hardest question, but it is the one that keeps coming up, which is, wanting an answer to how to support civil society.
Well, yeah, I think,
and it's really
to
difficult.
continue to support, and I think one of the ways to continue to give attention to these processes and through these attempts through which people try to challenge what is going on, and are critical about what is happening. So I think that in itself is important.
Yeah, thank you. So that ticked off a couple of questions. The other group of questions that I'm seeing is about the military, and whether we're already seeing a sort of a speeding up of a process that perhaps arguably began under Jokowi, and that is kind of giving increasing space to the military to play a role in sort of civilian government through different sorts of avenues. So, I mean, Marcus, like, you've written a book on the military in Indonesia, and I know that, there were moments during the Jokowi presidency, there was a lot of alarm and some alarmist pieces being written about kind of the chances of kind of a return to dui fungsi, and you were always, very level-headed about this. In fact, said there was no real kind of evidence of something of that kind of extreme outcome on the horizon. Have you changed your view? Do you think that we're seeing now, a faster and more serious I guess, militarization or potential return to dui fungsi under Prabowo?
Yeah, I mean, there are many indications, and they're easy to find all over the place, that Prabowo is not seeing the separation between civilian and military tasks as something that is worth defending. We start with the military training that the cabinet members received, that every governor, every district head, every mayor received. Everybody was herded into the military academy. So that's, and clearly he was not concerned at all about the optics that sent throughout society. Then he had a younger military officer recently trained in running state-owned companies, which clearly indicates he's thinking about roles for the military in non-military roles, and so forth. And of course, he has placed a lot of his military allies across the political spectrum in key positions. That doesn't mean, in my mind, that he thinks dui fungsi should be brought back, because dui fungsi puts the military in charge and not him, right? So we need to make sure we understand where dui fungsi was coming from. Dui fungsi was the dual function ideology created in 1966 to justify the full military involvement in politics after Suharto took power. Now, Suharto was an active military officer. He needed that ideology in order to justify his own rule. Once he had retired by 1978, he also then actually was fighting against an increasingly unhappy military in his own regime. So I think, yes, Prabowo wants an expansion of the military as far as it's useful for him, as far as he can control it, as far as it allows him to put his loyalists across the political system, but he will be very careful not to create a monster that he afterwards no longer can control. So dui fungsi, again, we need to understand what it is historically before we make big claims about its return. The way I think Prabowo understands it, it's a very limited, very pragmatic, very Machiavellian understanding of bringing some military people back, but not the institution.
Thank you. Again, I'm sort of folding some questions into one another. And Liam, I'll turn to you. So, we've talked about, we've given a pretty negative assessment of sort of policy making so far. But at the same time, Prabowo has really high approval ratings, or at least he did, according to recent polls. What do you think it takes for the public, knowing what you know about, sort of what the Indonesian public cares about from all the years of surveys? What would it take for the public, do you think, to lose trust in Prabowo? Again, it's a forward-looking question, but based on your...
Yeah, that's a great one. I mean, just bouncing off something that Ken said a little bit earlier. I'm a bit pessimistic actually about the sort of liberal democratic spirit among the populace. Quite frankly, if we've learned something about the Jokowi years and this solid decade of democratic backsliding under him, is that the voters are not the saviors, right? And in fact, I think that the voters' preferences are part of the problem. Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, that's a tiny proportion of the electorate, right? And for the average punter, the story of the Jokowi years was, yes, democratic backsliding, and you put a poll out, they say they're concerned about that, but ultimately, what they value more, what's more to the front of their mind is expanded economic opportunities, greater access to a social safety net, rising living standards overall, and for the average punter, the Jokowi years were pretty good. And so the question was, I'm sorry, what was the question I'm supposed to be answering?
Me too. I'm like, what?
Yeah.
What did I ask? No, it was about, so yeah, well, given all that, what does it take, do you think, for Prabowo's approval ratings to decline to a point where you might see a change in his behavior?
Look, the big question lingering there in the background is: does all this formula, the whole thing that the Marxists have been talking about and theorizing for years, this whole system of coalitional presidentialism, the formula that saw its apotheosis under Jokowi, and well, actually probably even more so under Prabowo, these huge broad coalitions where parties kind of just take it for granted that the president is going to be popular, he's going to be re-elected, and they sort of reflexively defer to him, with a bit of coercion on the side to sort of discipline the recalcitrants. How much of that is just underpinned by benign economic conditions and high approval ratings, right? Low inflation. Yes, the Indonesian economy now is chugging along nicely at 5% a year. You have core inflation of 2-point-something%, although, you get these headlines about deflation. But I think once you strip out volatile food prices and you strip out all the things that the prices of which the government controls, inflation's still something like 2%. Once that goes away, and keeping in mind that the education system is churning out all these graduates that aren't finding sort of decent formal sector jobs, I mean, if you get this steady deterioration in economic conditions, what does that do to the president's approval rating? And then do his party allies and all the oligarchs around him sort of run for the hills if they lose confidence in if they think that, he's vulnerable in 2029? Do you start seeing a crack up in the coalition? I don't know. I mean, I think really the one thing that you've got to keep a laser-like focus on is, inflation, people's subjective perceptions of how the economy is going, and it's a sort of sustained economic downturn and a hit on people's living standards that can't be papered over with more, cash transfers and subsidies.
Right. So if that sort of kind of those expressions of dissatisfaction and frustration that Ken talked about within that particular sort of class of activists, especially young activists, whether if that sort of spreads as a function of other sorts of economic... Not
really. Students are always going to be angry for a range of things. It's part of their function of the political system, but does the silent majority of people who just sort of are happy with what they're getting economically from the government in terms of governance improvements and whatever, does the silent majority turn against the government if the economy goes bad?
That's what I meant to say, that like if that sort of frustration that is now kind of contained to the kind of activist, progressive and student movement, if that becomes something that resonates then with a much broader, much bigger public because of a shift in economic circumstances, right?
Yeah, totally. Sorry, I misunderstood. Yeah,
No,
sorry,
that's
we're on the
okay.
same
That
page
was
there.
probably, no, I probably butchered my own sentence. I know that Ken has to leave on the dot, and we probably should really wrap up on the dot, unless Marcus or Ken, you wanted to add 30 seconds to add anything at the end there.
No, just to reiterate what Liam said, but that applies to any political system, right? So once the economy goes, satisfaction goes with whatever system is in place. And I would also add that, in fact, both under Yudhoyono and Jokowi, that control of inflation was, in fact, a major part of that political machinery. And for Jokowi, it was the number one thing. And he always knew that that was the one thing that would determine his survival in office. Now, that's where the risk now lies with all of these budget cuts. You know, I think if there is a sort of a trickle-down effect on the health system, on the quality of roads, on the quality of schools and whatever, if the lunch program isn't working out the way it was supposed to, that's when the approval rating might fall, but it will fall from a very high plateau, right? He's now at 80%. He can go down to 65, I think, without any major repercussions. So at the moment, as you suggested, Eve, I think for him, it's still going well.
Yeah, and I think that circles back to what Ken said at the very beginning, which is those budget cuts can have real life effects. We just haven't felt them yet, and that they matter for people. And you know, you could very well see dissatisfaction, you know, spread beyond that sort of small group of activists. Ken, 30 seconds, or you have to go actually, don't you?
Yeah, I do, but I think, you know, maybe the other thing is, I think it's really important to differentiate, you know, differentiate between, we see these protests, but of course, you know, there's a big silent group that we don't hear about. And yes, maybe it's about, you know, satisfaction, but it's also about just survival. People just want to survive to the next day, and therefore, you know, are not going to, or are more reluctant to engage with these big political questions, right? Because you're just focused on getting by.
Exactly.
And I also think the other point around, I think, you know, Indonesia has, and we know this, has very vibrant and lively and vocal a civil society that espouses liberal democratic values, but it's also about that connecting that to policy and being heard by policymakers and actually having an effect on policy and then practice. And that has been, you know, that's been a challenge for a very long time. So it's not unique to what's happening now.
That's right. Or unique to Indonesia, in fact.
No, exactly.
The region or even other countries, established democracies.
Yeah.
So that on that sort of actually quite negative note, I guess, in the end, I was thinking you were going to end us on a positive note, but yeah, we're on the fence. Anyway, so just let me very quickly thank College of Asia Pacific Partnership, Setiawan in particular, for helping us put this together. Huge thanks to our panel, and we had over 130 people joining us, and there were so many questions I couldn't get to them. That's why I had to do that sort of rolling into this and rolling into that. So I apologize for whomever I might have missed. Thank you very much. Please join us again, join our mailing list if you'd like to hear more panels like this over the course of 2025. You'll see reappearances of Marcus, Liam and Ken, I'm sure, but we'll bring in some new experts as well. So please join us again soon, and thank you for coming along. Terima kasih banyak. Thank you. Goodbye, everyone.
Thanks, Eve. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.